The haunting melody drifted through the empty chapel on the edge of Whispering Creek, a town barely clinging to existence in the harsh Arizona territory of 1876. Hannah Keller's fingers trembled against the worn piano keys as she poured her grief into a hymn she'd composed for her departed father. She didn't hear the chapel door creak open, didn't notice the tall figure silhouetted against the dying sunlight until a strangled sob broke her concentration. Hannah's fingers froze mid-chord as she turned to find a man she'd never seen before standing in the aisle, his weathered face streaked with tears and his hand clutching a worn hat against his chest. His eyes, the color of a summer storm, met hers with such raw emotion that she felt as if he'd somehow peered into her very soul. "I'm sorry, madam," he said, quickly wiping his face with a bandana. "I didn't mean to intrude. You're playing. It reminded me of someone." His voice was deep yet gentle, carrying the subtle drawl of Texas. Hannah felt heat rise to her cheeks. No one except her father had ever heard her original compositions. "The chapel's open to all, sir. No intrusion." She smoothed her simple blue dress, suddenly aware of how disheveled she must look after hours at the piano. "Yates Aldridge," he introduced himself with a slight bow. "Just passing through, heard the music and couldn't help myself." "Hannah Keller," she replied, standing to offer a proper greeting. "Most folks around here know better than to disturb the empty chapel when I'm playing." Yates approached slowly, his spurs making a gentle jingling sound against the wooden floor. "That piece, did you write it yourself?" There was genuine awe in his voice. "I did, for my father. He passed 3 months ago. My condolences, Miss Keller. It was beautiful enough to make a grown man weep, as you clearly witnessed." His sheepish smile transformed his face, softening the hard lines carved by sun and hardship. Hannah found herself smiling back, the first genuine smile that had crossed her lips since her father's passing. "Thank you, Mr. Aldridge. Would you like to hear it properly, without interruption this time?" "I'd be honored, madam." And so, with the sun setting through the chapel's small stained glass window, Hannah played for this stranger whose tears had somehow begun healing her own heart. Yates hadn't planned to stay in Whispering Creek more than a night. He'd been drifting for 2 years since the war, taking odd jobs and keeping to himself. But something about Hannah Keller's music and the quiet dignity with which she carried her grief resonated with him in ways he couldn't explain. The next morning he found himself at the town's only mercantile, which Hannah's late father had owned and she now ran with her younger sister. "Mr. Aldridge," Hannah said with surprise when he entered, the small bell above the door announcing his arrival. "I didn't expect to see you again." "Miss Keller," he nodded, suddenly feeling awkward in his freshly dusted clothes. "I thought I might inquire if there's work to be found in these parts. Seems my horse could use a rest and I—" He trailed off, unwilling to admit that it was her music, her presence that had made him reconsider his plans. Hannah studied him carefully. At 24, she'd learned to be cautious around drifters, but something in Yates's honest gaze made her trust him despite her better judgment. "As it happens, Mr. Aldridge, we're short-handed since Father passed. My sister and I have been struggling to manage deliveries to the outlying ranches." She hesitated. "It's not much, but if you're handy with a wagon and can defend a shipment if necessary." "I can handle both, madam. Been driving wagons since I was 12 and—" He patted the holstered Colt at his hip. "I can protect what needs protecting." Hannah's sister, Elizabeth, emerged from the storeroom, giving Yates a suspicious glance. "Hannah, are you hiring this man? We know nothing about him." "He's just passing through, Lizzie. We need the help." Hannah turned back to Yates. "The position is temporary, Mr. Aldridge, until we can find someone permanent." "Temporary suits me fine," Yates replied, though something in his chest tightened at the word. "When would you like me to start?" "Today, if possible. We have deliveries waiting for the Hartman Ranch and supplies that Sheriff Taylor ordered last week." By noon, Yates had loaded the wagon and was heading out of town with a list of deliveries and a map Hannah had drawn. As he drove, he found himself humming the melody she had played in the chapel, wondering what twist of fate had brought him to her doorstep. For Hannah, the days that followed brought an unexpected lightening of her spirit. Yates proved himself reliable and hardworking, handling the deliveries efficiently and even repairing the leaky roof of the mercantile without being asked. Each evening, when the store closed, they found themselves sharing conversations that stretched later and later into the night. "You never speak of your family," Hannah observed one evening as they sat on the porch of the mercantile, the spring air carrying the scent of desert flowers. "Do you have one waiting somewhere?" Yates stared into the distance, his profile sharp against the twilight. "Lost them, all of them. My parents before the war, my brother during it." He flexed his left hand, and Hannah noticed for the first time the faint scars that crisscrossed his palm. "Fought for the Union, came back to Texas to find our ranch burned to the ground." Hannah's heart ached for him. "I'm sorry, Yates." He turned to her, the use of his first name not escaping his notice. "Nothing to be sorry for. Life deals its cards and we play the hand we're given." His gaze softened. "Your music helps, makes the memories easier to bear." Hannah felt her cheeks warm. "Would you like to hear more?" "The chapel has better acoustics than my father's old piano at home." "I would like nothing better." That night, Hannah played for hours in the empty chapel, pouring into her music feelings she dared not speak aloud. And Yates listened, sometimes with eyes closed, sometimes watching her with an intensity that made her fingers tremble on the keys. As weeks passed, Hannah found herself looking forward to the moments they shared. Yates had become indispensable to the mercantile, and even Elizabeth had grudgingly admitted he was a godsend. But it was more than his help with the business that made Hannah's heart beat faster when he entered a room. One evening in late May, a thunderstorm swept through Whispering Creek. Hannah had stayed late at the chapel, working on a new composition, when the skies opened. She was preparing to make a dash for home when Yates appeared at the door, soaked to the skin but holding a lantern and her shawl. "Thought you might need this," he said, dripping onto the chapel floor. "Storm came on quick." "You're drenched," Hannah exclaimed, taking the shawl. "You'll catch your death." "Worth it to make sure you're safe." His eyes held hers, and for a moment neither spoke. Then a crash of thunder broke the spell. "We should wait it out," Hannah suggested, gesturing to the bench. "Play with me. I've been working on a duet." Yates raised an eyebrow. "I'm no musician, Hannah. I'll teach you the simple part, please." Unable to refuse her, Yates settled beside her on the bench, their shoulders touching. Hannah guided his hands to the keys, showing him a simple repeating pattern. Their fingers brushed, and she felt a jolt of awareness that had nothing to do with the lightning outside. As they played together, the simple melody and harmony entwining, Hannah felt something shift between them. Yates's hands, so large and capable, moved with surprising grace over the keys, and when he missed a note and laughed, the sound was so full of joy that Hannah couldn't help joining in. When the storm finally passed, they walked back to the mercantile together, the wet streets gleaming in the moonlight. At her door, Yates hesitated. "Thank you for the music, Hannah, and for—" He seemed to struggle for words, "for making me feel like I might belong somewhere again." Before she could respond, he tipped his hat and disappeared into the night, leaving Hannah staring after him with her heart hammering in her chest. The next day brought trouble to Whispering Creek. A gang of cattle rustlers who had been terrorizing nearby towns arrived, led by the notorious Illy Graves. They sauntered into the mercantile while Hannah was alone, Elizabeth having gone to visit a friend. "Well now, what have we here?" Graves drawled, his eyes roaming over Hannah in a way that made her skin crawl. "Prettiest shopkeeper I've ever seen." Hannah stood her ground behind the counter. "Can I help you gentlemen find something?" "Oh, I've found what I'm looking for," Graves replied with a leer. He reached across the counter to touch her cheek, but before his fingers made contact, a voice cut through the tension. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." Yates stood in the doorway, his stance casual but his hand hovering near his holster. Graves turned slowly. "This ain't your business, cowboy. The lady doesn't welcome your attention. That makes it my business." Yates's voice was calm, but Hannah could see the steel in his eyes. For a tense moment, the two men stared at each other. Then Graves laughed, a harsh sound. "Another time, perhaps." He nodded to his men and they filed out, but not before Graves added, "We'll be seeing you around, miss." When they were gone, Hannah let out a shaky breath. "Thank you, Yates." His jaw was tight as he watched through the window as the men mounted their horses. "Those men are trouble, Hannah. Graves has a reputation that would curdle milk. Sheriff Taylor will handle them." "Sheriff Taylor is one man. Those were 5 and all armed to the teeth." Yates turned to her, concern etched on his face. "Promise me you'll be careful. Keep the store locked when you're alone." His protective instinct touched her deeply. "I promise." That night, unable to sleep, Hannah slipped out to the chapel. The moon was full, casting long shadows through the windows as she sat at the piano. She began to play, losing herself in the music, unaware that Graves and his men had returned to town and were watching the chapel from the shadows. Inside, Hannah's fingers danced over the keys, her heart full of confusing emotions. She hadn't expected to feel this way about a drifter, a man who by his own admission never stayed in one place for long. Yet Yates had brought color back into her world, had made her feel protected and understood in ways no one else ever had. She was so absorbed in her playing that she didn't hear the chapel door open, didn't realize she was no longer alone until a hand clamped over her mouth. She struggled, but Graves's grip was iron. "Such pretty music," he whispered against her ear. "I thought we might continue our conversation from earlier without interruption this time." Hannah fought, but Graves was too strong. He began dragging her toward the door where his men waited, but they never made it that far. The chapel door burst open and Yates stood framed in the moonlight, his gun drawn. "Let her go, Graves." Graves pulled Hannah in front of him as a shield, pressing a knife to her throat. "You're outnumbered, cowboy. My boys are right outside." "We're outside," Yates corrected. "Sheriff's got them in custody already. It's just you and me now." Hannah could feel Graves's uncertainty. She seized the moment, stomping hard on his foot and twisting away as he cursed. Yates lunged forward, tackling Graves before he could recover. The two men crashed into a pew, grappling for control of the knife. Hannah grabbed a heavy candlestick, raising it high but hesitated, afraid of hitting Yates in the struggle. She needn't have worried. With a swift move, Yates disarmed Graves and landed a punch that left the outlaw unconscious on the chapel floor. Breathing hard, Yates turned to Hannah. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, trembling with reaction. Without a word, Yates crossed to her and pulled her into his arms. She clung to him, feeling the rapid beat of his heart against her cheek. "I was so afraid," she whispered against his chest. "How did you know?" "I couldn't sleep. Kept thinking about those men, about you." His arms tightened around her. "I was checking the town when I saw the light in the chapel. Then I spotted their horses." Hannah pulled back to look up at him, seeing in his eyes the same emotions that churned within her. "Yates." The chapel door opened again, this time revealing Sheriff Taylor and his deputy. "Miss Keller, are you all right?" The moment broken. Yates stepped away from Hannah as the lawmen took custody of the still unconscious Graves. It took time to explain what had happened, to give statements and assure the growing crowd of townspeople that Hannah was unharmed. By the time they finished, dawn was breaking over the desert. Exhausted, Hannah allowed Yates to escort her home, where Elizabeth tearfully embraced her before insisting she rest. Hannah slept through most of the day, waking in the late afternoon to find a note had been slipped under her door. In Yates's bold handwriting, it read simply, "Meet me at the chapel at sunset." Her heart racing, Hannah dressed carefully in her best dress, a soft lavender that brought out the blue in her eyes. She pinned up her dark hair, leaving a few curls to frame her face, and dabbed a touch of her precious rose water behind her ears. The whole town was buzzing with the story of how Yates had saved her from Graves. As she walked to the chapel, several people stopped her to express their relief at her safety and their admiration for that brave Mr. Aldridge. The chapel was empty when she arrived, but someone had lit candles on the altar and placed wildflowers in tin cans along the aisle. Hannah moved to the piano, running her fingers lightly over the keys, remembering how it had all begun with a song that made a stranger weep. "I hoped you'd play again." She turned to find Yates in the doorway, looking uncharacteristically nervous. He had traded his usual work clothes for a clean white shirt and dark vest. His hair was combed back, and he'd clearly taken great care with his appearance. "I wasn't sure I could," Hannah admitted, "after last night. I understand." He came to sit beside her on the bench. "But I hope you will someday. Your music is too beautiful to be silenced by fear." Hannah studied his face, this man who had ridden into her life and changed everything. "Why did you ask me here, Yates?" He took a deep breath. "I've been drifting since the war ended. Never stayed anywhere long enough to put down roots, never wanted to." His eyes held hers. "Until now." Hannah's heart began to race. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I love you, Hannah Keller. I've loved you since I heard your song in this empty chapel, and it made me weep for all I'd lost and for all I might find again." He took her hands in his. "I don't have much to offer, just myself, my hands, and a promise to cherish you all the days of my life." Tears filled Hannah's eyes. "That's more than enough." Yates slid from the bench to one knee, still holding her hands. "Hannah, will you marry me? Will you make music with me for the rest of our days?" "Yes," she whispered, joy bubbling up inside her. "Yes, Yates, I will." He rose, cupping her face in his hands with infinite tenderness, and sealed his vow with a kiss that promised a lifetime of love. Their wedding, held in the same chapel 3 weeks later, was the event of the year in Whispering Creek. The entire town turned out to witness Hannah Keller, in a gown of ivory satin that had once been her mother's, pledge her life to Yates Aldridge. Elizabeth, initially wary of the match, had come around completely when she saw how happy Yates made her sister. She stood proudly as Hannah's witness, while Sheriff Taylor stood up for Yates, having developed a friendship with the former drifter who now talked of putting down permanent roots. True to his word, Yates invested his savings in the mercantile, expanding it to include a livery stable that quickly became the most successful business in the growing town. Hannah continued to run the store, but also began giving piano lessons to the children of Whispering Creek, her music now filling not just the chapel but homes throughout the community. They built a small house on the edge of town, with a view of the desert that Hannah loved to paint when she wasn't playing music. And on quiet evenings, they would walk to the chapel together, where Yates would listen as Hannah played, sometimes with tears in his eyes, always with love in his heart. A year after their wedding, Hannah composed a new piece to celebrate the birth of their daughter, Rose. Yates held the infant as Hannah played, the three of them bathed in the golden light streaming through the chapel windows. When she finished, Yates kissed her with the same reverence as that first time. "Your music gave me back my heart," he whispered against her lips, "and now you've given me a family too." "We gave each other a second chance," Hannah replied, touching his cheek. "A new song to sing together." As Whispering Creek grew into a proper town, the Aldridge family grew along with it. A son, James, joined them 2 years after Rose, and the mercantile expanded to become a department store that served the entire county. Yates's livery stable evolved into a successful horse breeding operation, his stock sought after throughout the territory. Hannah's reputation as a musician spread beyond the town limits. She was invited to perform in Tucson and Phoenix, though she rarely accepted, preferring to stay close to home and family. She did, however, publish several of her compositions, which found their way into parlors across the country. Through it all, the chapel remained their special place. When the town built a larger church to accommodate the growing population, Yates purchased the old chapel, preserving it as a place where Hannah could play undisturbed and where their children could learn to appreciate the power of music. On their 10th anniversary, Yates surprised Hannah by gathering their friends and family in the chapel for a special celebration. When everyone was seated, he led Hannah to the piano and handed her a slim leather-bound book. "What's this?" she asked, running her fingers over the embossed cover. "Open it," he urged gently. Inside, she found sheet music, her compositions, professionally printed and bound, with a dedication page that read, "To Hannah, whose song in an empty chapel made a broken man weep, and whose love made him whole again. With eternal devotion, Yates." Tears blurred Hannah's vision as she looked up at her husband. "How did you do this?" "I sent your manuscripts to a publisher in Chicago last year. They want to print all of your work." Yates's smile was tender. "The world deserves to hear what I heard that day." "Play for us, Mama." 8-year-old Rose called from her seat beside Elizabeth. Hannah positioned her fingers over the keys and began to play the very piece that had first brought Yates into her life. As the familiar melody filled the chapel, she glanced at her husband, remembering the stranger whose tears had somehow healed her grief. Yates stood beside her, one hand resting lightly on her shoulder, his face reflecting the same wonder and love she'd seen that very first day. When she finished playing, he leaned down to whisper in her ear, "I thank God every day that I heard your music drifting through the door of this chapel." His voice was husky with emotion. "You saved me, Hannah." "We saved each other," she replied, reaching up to touch his face. "And we'll keep doing so every day for the rest of our lives." As the years passed, their love only deepened. They weathered the challenges that came their way: drought years that threatened the livery, illness that confined Hannah to bed for months, the inevitable conflicts that arise in any marriage. Through it all, they remained steadfast in their devotion to each other and to the family they had created. Their children grew, with Rose inheriting her mother's musical talent and James his father's way with horses. The Aldridge name became synonymous with integrity and generosity throughout the territory, their businesses thriving as Arizona moved toward statehood. On quiet evenings, long after the children were grown and had families of their own, Yates and Hannah would still make their way to the old chapel. There, in the peaceful sanctuary where their love had begun, Hannah would play, and sometimes Yates would still weep at the beauty of her music and the gift of their life together. And when she finished playing, he would take her in his arms, kiss her with the tenderness of a love that had endured for decades, and renew the vow he had made on his knees so many years before, a vow to love her all the days of his life. It was a promise he kept until his last breath at the age of 82, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, with Hannah's hand clasped in his, and the melody of her love still playing in his heart. Hannah lived 5 more years after Yates passed, continuing to play in the chapel almost daily. The townspeople of Whispering Creek, now a bustling city, would often hear the haunting melodies drifting through the open doors and know that Mrs. Aldridge was remembering her beloved husband. When she finally joined him, they buried her beside Yates in the small cemetery behind the chapel, beneath a headstone that bore a simple musical score, the first few notes of the song that had brought them together. And though the chapel stands empty now, those who enter swear they can still hear the echo of a piano and the whispered vow of a cowboy, whose heart was healed by a song and sealed with a kiss.